Hello, happy Friday and welcome to this British Academy event, part of the Being Human Festival. I'm Leah Hislop, I'm the Deputy Editor of Waitress Food Magazine and a cookbook author. The British Academy is the UK's leading organisation for the humanities and social sciences. We are an independent fellowship of world-leading scholars, a funding body that supports new research nationally and internationally, and a forum for debate and engagement. Today is our first event as part of Being Human, the UK's National Festival for the Humanities. And over the next week, researchers will be sharing some of the exciting work taking place up and down the country. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by food historians Rachel Rich and Lisa Smith. Rachel is a reader in history at Leeds Beckett University, while Lisa is a lecturer in history at the University of Essex. Their research on European cuisines and British identity featured in this year's British Academy Virtual Summer Showcase, and they are now exploring what foods we eat reveal about British tastes and international influences. As part of this event, we'd love you to share your own favourite recipes to show how varied British tastes are today. And you can do this by emailing the team at newbritishcookbook@gmail.com. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Rachel and Lisa to our virtual stage for a discussion about their fascinating research. Hello, everyone. We're going to speak in conversation for about 40 minutes, during which there will be some pop quiz questions for you to take part in at home. And towards the end of the event, we'll take a selection of audience questions too. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit this in the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. You can also tweet us during the events and can tag us at British Academy. So welcome, Rachel and Lisa. We have 250 years of British cuisine to discuss. So we're going to start right at the beginning at the court of George III. To get everyone at home thinking, we've got a couple of questions to test your knowledge, and you should find those popping up at the bottom of your screen now.
Yeah, and I'm just going to read out a couple of questions which are on the screen. So the first question we want to challenge you with is to ask which vegetable you think never appeared on the table of George III's household. So was the vegetable that never appeared broccoli? Was it tomato? Was it potato? Or was it carrot? And we also have a question about spices, because whilst British food might unfairly be accused of being bland, the spicery was well stocked in the household of George III. So, which spice did he not have in his cupboard? Was it nutmeg? Was it cloves? Was it caraway seed, cinnamon, or cayenne pepper? I'm going to give people a little chance to come up with their answers before I give away the solution. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to think about these vegetables, and I can now reveal that the vegetable that never appeared on George III's tables was tomato. And you're going to find out why if you keep listening to what we're going to be discussing. But I'm afraid to admit that the spices question was a trick. All those spices appeared on the tables of George III. They had a very well-stocked spice cupboard.
Great. So we can see from those quiz questions a little bit of what might have featured on the menu at the Georgian court. Far from being bland here, we have plenty of flavours and ingredients from across the world. So British royals at that time, they shared a liking for these flavours with their subjects. So Lisa and Rachel, why do you think these international influences were received so positively? Was our food before very boring?
Not at all. And it also depends on which one we're thinking of here. So on the list that Rachel just read off, it's important to keep in mind that some of these were New World imports. For example, potatoes came from the New World, and when the English and Spanish were in North and South America, they brought back lots of potatoes, and they became popular very quickly. They taste good. They are more versatile than things like the rutabagas, which they replaced, and they were also cheap. they didn't spoil very easily. So that was something that was appealing to all classes in Britain. If we're thinking, though, about broccoli, this was a vegetable that had been around for a long time and was commonly eaten in Italy. But we can think about that within the context of the grand tour that a lot of very wealthy British men were doing, young men were doing in the 18th century, where they'd go all around Europe and hit all of the travel highlights, go to Rome and places like that. And they brought back a taste for a lot of the foods that they were eating while they were on their travels. So broccoli became popular in the 18th century, largely because of that growing interest in travel. But that was for elite tables, really. Spices, though, had been around for a long time. They were very commonly used in medieval cooking, for example. The only one on that list that was new in the 18th century, or relatively new, was the cayenne pepper. It had been used medicinally since they brought it back again from the New World, but the cayenne pepper was something that only started being used in curries and things like that in the 18th century. So it was a fairly new flavor as well.
I think too, with the all the different flavors when they arrived, that there is a fashion in food. Like now, obviously, Leah, you know all about food fashions with editing food magazines. But I think that even though fashion trends may be transmitted more slowly, there were fashions in food, and people did want to have what they saw maybe wealthier, more privileged people having. And I think that's why by the 18th century, you can buy these spices sort of all over the country. People might assume that it was a London thing to be able to have access to sort of these more exotic ingredients, but actually you could find them pretty much anywhere by then. We were surprised about that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I understand that a person's diet could be associated sometimes with their personality or even their morality. So George III's nickname was Farmer George. What does that tell us about the kind of food he was serving?
It's a bit of a double-edged thing, this kind of Farmer George nickname. He was called Farmer George partly because he really did have an interest in farming and in agriculture. He was interested in modern technologies, which, might include things like being able to grow vegetables out of season in hothouses. And he had a lot of vegetables served at his table. It was something that he appreciated. A lot of the food that they were serving at the royal tables was grown on the royal estates. So in the way that we might in the 21st century appreciate the idea of eating local, George III really did eat local in a lot of ways in terms of where the produce was coming from. And so in some ways it was a positive nickname. Farmer George, he tended to his vegetables. But in another way, and in terms of you're saying, our food choices tell people something about who we are, I think it was a bit of people were making fun of him a little bit. He wasn't seen as having as luxurious a taste as you might expect a king to have. And so he was called Farmer George in a slightly derisory way as well, because his taste in food was so modest. They didn't drink a lot of alcohol at Kew. They didn't eat a lot of what would have counted in those days as very lavish meals. And in fact, one of George's favorite things to eat was eggs and spinach. He had very modest taste.
Sounds like quite a nice meal, eggs and spinach. I'd be quite happy with that. The 18th century was a time of growing British nationalism. It's obviously also a time when the British Empire was expanding. Was there any resistance to some international dishes that weren't adopted as part of the British diet? And if so, why do you think that might be?
Well, some of the things on the quiz, again, were ones that weren't necessarily adopted very quickly. The tomato, for example, again, was a New World vegetable, and the Spanish took it back to Spain, and it was very popular there. It was used throughout the Caribbean as well, especially in Spanish-held territories, but the British did not really have a taste for it. And one of the reasons is that they were suspicious. For example, John Gerard, who was a herbalist in the 16th century, famously described the tomato and talked about how it was poisonous because it came from the nightshade family. And so that idea sort of lingers on about how certain foods aren't necessarily very good for you. There's other issues too, where foods go in and out of favor, but they might also become politicized. And one of the big ones that became very politicized in the 18th century was sugar, which of course was produced by and large in the Caribbean using slave labor. By the 1790s, a lot of the abolitionists were very clear that they did not think people should be eating sugar. And there was a movement called the anti-saccharide movement, or the anti-sugar movement, where they promoted just, if you stop buying sugar, that will help to stop slavery. And in fact, one of the people who was leading the anti-saccharide movement was Olaudah Equiano, who was a former slave who had moved to London after he received his freedom. So you can see those sorts of dark histories there. Chocolate was another New World one. And you can see in this case how different preferences really shaped what people started to eat. So, for example, the Spanish were the first to bring back chocolate from Mexico, or from what is Mexico today. And for the Spanish who came back home, came back to Spain, they tended to associate it with the family and friends that they had met in Spain and the lifestyle that they had gotten used to. So for them, they wanted to recreate it as closely as possible. And they tended to make it very, very dark chocolate and very spicy. However, this didn't necessarily appeal to other European tastes, especially the further north they went. And the English, by the 17th century, were adding a lot of sugar and milk to it, more along the lines of our modern day milk chocolate. And so it was a matter of personal preference, but also access to the flavorings. Even with the Spanish, they couldn't always get the same spices that they'd had in Mexico, so they often had to substitute different flavorings. So substitution could be important too.
I think also in terms of foods that were maybe rejected for being too foreign, there could sometimes be a sort of social class or status element to that. Because, for example, if you look at sort of the way that people in the 19th century thought about French food, it was quite elitist, I think, to have a preference for French food. And so if you wanted to show yourself to be a plain, honest Englishman, you would reject French food as being sort of too luxurious for the honest British people. But that doesn't mean that people didn't eat French food. French food has had a tremendous influence all along on the British diet, but rather that sometimes people could pick and choose how they interacted with foreign food as part of what they wanted to portray as their own identity in relation to their own ideas of Britishness.
That's really interesting. So obviously, you know, nationalism arguably is strengthening across Europe at the moment and in the UK, as we see with Brexit. How do we reconcile these ideas with, you know, the fact that international foods are so at the heart of present day British food? You know, I'm thinking of things like, you know, mango chutney, fajita sushi. You know, you open my cupboard and there's the whole world in there now. How do we reconcile those ideas?
Yeah, it's a complicated story, I think, the way that European nations have taken on foods from elsewhere. And it is a story about power and about colonialism. And I think that, Lisa, you started to hint at that when you were talking about sugar and slavery. And, you know, in a way, kind of food history originates in a lot of ways as an academic discipline with the history of sugar and slavery. There's a very famous book called Sweetness and Power by an American anthropologist, Sidney Mintz. And so I think that from the very start, food historians are aware of sort of questions of power. But because the Europeans, and in this case, we're talking about the British, who are approaching kind of a period where they're going to be the global dominant power when we're talking about George's empire, because they have the power, they can appropriate what they want from everywhere that they go. And I think that for whatever reason, which, you know, I agree, it's a good question, Leah, and it is hard to understand why you can, on the one hand, be very kind of nationalistically pro-British and deriding the colonial people that you encounter, or nowadays maybe for some people it's deriding the European Union, but still want to taste all those foods. But I think that in the case of the British Empire, because they were entering from the powerful position, they could just accumulate the best of everything they found, and it didn't seem contradictory to them to take that into their own culture.
Yeah, so food was just one of the many things. Oh, go on.
Yeah. No, I think I'd also add, though, that food can also be a useful bridge, especially within the sort of, heated nationalist moments. So just one example is in Colchester, which is where the University of Essex is. There's the Refugee Action Colchester that recently put out a lovely cookbook called Something to Share, which was put together, that this Syrian community in Colchester put together, and it came out of a pop-up cafe that had been set up from 2016 onward, that shared Syrian community within Colchester and was very, very popular. So food here can be a bridge, from showing people what different tastes are, and eating together can be a very powerful symbol as well, that once you break bread together, that you can forge new relationships. So it can be, as Rachel explained, there's the dark side, but there's also the potential positives out of using these opportunities of bridging gaps through food culture.
It's definitely a powerful thing. This leads us on to our next couple of quiz questions, which Lisa is going to read, and they should be popping up on your screen now.
All right. So first of all, which French-named dish appeared more than any other in George III's kitchen? Was it soupe santé, which translates as healthy soup? It was made out of lettuce, celery, carrots, leek, and turnip. Was it boeuf tremblant, in other words, boiled beef, served in a thick gravy with a sharp pickle sauce? Was it blancmange, a sweet meat made of dissolved isinglass or gelatin that was boiled with milk and then formed an opaque white jelly? Or was it des œufs brouillis, or scrambled eggs? Right, next question. Which wine was the choice of the king's kitchen? Was it French claret, Portuguese Madeira, or was it German hock? I don't know.
Quite like the sound of beef in a pickle sauce.
It does sound quite appealing, although soup santé sounds really nice on a cold evening. So I can reveal the answers now that you've probably had a chance to do them. Blancmange was the most popular French dish on George's menu. It appeared 48 times at Q. And the most popular wine was German hock. Not specifically because George III was German. In fact, it had been popular since George I, who brought it from Hanover. So,
okay. So talking about, dishes that feel very British. I mean, I think chicken tikka masala is a classic example, isn't it, of a dish in this country which is, universally beloved, but has its roots in another cuisine, as Robin Cook famously said in his speech in 2001. And in that way, it's kind of in a direct line, isn't it, to those hybrid dishes at courts like George III's, which also incorporated international influences. How and why have recipes been adapted over time to become part of the British kitchen?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question, this question about, the hybridity of cuisines. And I think that probably all cuisines, in a way, do a lot of borrowing and adapting. People use the ingredients they have at hand. Mrs Beeton, in her famous Book of Household Management from 1861, which is possibly one of the most famous cookbooks, certainly in the English language, has a recipe for a mango chutney that doesn't contain any mangoes, right? So there's a taste by 1861 for mango chutney in this country, which can't be answered with the readily available local produce for most housewives. And so they find solutions. I think that's such an intriguing example of how food hybrids are born. But also, I think, when Robin Cook made that speech in 2001 where he called chicken tikka masala the favorite dish of this country, it was an interesting moment because he was being incredibly positive and optimistic about the future of multiculturalism. And he was calling on the past and on the colonial past in a way that seemed very sort of optimistic about where we could go. I think that we're in an interesting moment now because, at least for people who work and study in universities, we talk a lot now about decolonizing the curriculum and recognizing more of the impact of the colonial past on the present. And again, questions about the food that we eat are a great place to do that because cultures do borrow and share and mutually influence. When I was thinking about the question of hybrid foods, I didn't only think about chicken tikka masala. I also immediately started to think about Claudia Rodden's book about Jewish cooking. And I don't know, maybe people in the audience will be familiar with that book. But she writes really beautifully about the Jewish diaspora and how Jewish food has certain recognizable qualities. Food for Jewish people is very symbolic and meaningful within religious and cultural practices. But at the same time, Jewish people who've lived in different parts of Europe, their food recipes have been adapted according to local taste, according to the availability of certain ingredients. And so there isn't a thing called Jewish food. There are Jewish foods. And I think that probably the same is true of all diasporas. And so if we think about Britain today, there are people who are British, but who have their roots in Pakistan, in India, in all parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and they've brought with them food habits, which they've adapted again and again. And of course, all of us are always benefiting from those adoptions because, you just have to walk down any high street or any British town to see the number of restaurants we have at our disposal now. So I think that, there is something really exciting about hybrid foods, even if there's also something to investigate in terms of how those cultural encounters have happened over time.
That's fascinating. I think, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, what is British food today in many ways? How much of our food does come from all these different places? I mean, fish and chips is a great one, isn't it? I think that we think as quintessentially British, but I think that's partly Jewish, isn't it? Or there was an influence there.
Yeah, the fish, the fried fish was considered a very Jewish thing, wasn't it, in the 19th century? And just to plug it once again, but that's, what we're looking for with our new British cookbook project is to find out what are people really eating at home. It's so easy to go online and see beautiful images of food, on all sorts of websites. But it's really interesting to think about, what people are actually cooking in their homes and where their influences are coming from.
I was interested in what you were talking about earlier, Lisa, the community cookbook you were talking about in Colchester. What is the history of community cookbooks? And I think, there's been a lot of them this year, actually. I think partly due to the impact of COVID, there's been quite a lot of fundraising ones.
Yeah.
But what is the history of them? And how can it help us understand why food is so central to people's sense of self and place?
Yeah, so first of all, for those of you who might not know, a community cookbook is a cookbook that has been created within a community for a particular purpose, usually fundraising. So, for example, Leah just alluded to some of the COVID-19 fundraising ones, but the suffragettes tended to put them out in the early part of the 20th century. Lots of schools and church groups, and as you may have noticed, both Rachel and I are Canadian, and in North America, community cookbooks are a very big thing. But there has been this recent resurgence of them in Britain as well. So the community cookbooks usually have a purpose, but what they can also do is provide a lovely snapshot of that community at a particular point in time. So, they often will label them according to names, so you can tell who shared the recipes. You can get a sense of who is what somebody's favorite food is, because that might be what they've put in, or it might be that they have put in something that they're very famous for in the community, like somebody's famous cinnamon buns or what have you. So they're a really good snapshot, and they're a good snapshot in other ways too, because community cookbooks often have little stories about the food, or little jokes, or insight into the community. So they're a great way in just getting a sense of the people and the particular community who created that book. So you also get a sense too of the tastes and flavors that people like. A community cookbook from the 1970s is bound to have lots of those jellied salads and all sorts of things like that. That we associate with the 70s, and for good reason, because they were often served at things like church dinner and community functions. So they're a really good insight into how people saw themselves within that community and how that community put itself forward as well. And food is an important method of doing that.
That's fascinating. Do you think that food and recipe blogs have slightly taken the place of community cookbooks? I mean, they do that same thing, I suppose, don't they, in creating a place where people can share their culinary knowledge and comment on it and exchange ideas?
Yeah, I think they're interesting, the food blogs. I mean, there's obviously so much food on the internet, and there's so many things that can be labeled as food blogs that probably anything we might say about them, someone out there has a favorite food blog that will belie our statements. But, I think that in a way, a lot of the food blogs, they can be quite sort of aspirational. They have a sort of a lifestyle thing going on that's a bit like food for the Instagram generation. And that doesn't mean that they're not great. I mean, it's great. I think, a lot of us now, go online first when we're looking for recipes. We don't so much take our cookbooks off the shelves as much as we used to, because there's so many recipes online. And in that sense, I think that food bloggers and food sites of all kind, they fulfill a really important role. And certainly, the fact that you can find a recipe for any food of anywhere in the world pretty much instantaneously is pretty exciting. But I think that in some ways, the fact that they often have such beautiful pictures, and it seems so hard to aspire to living up to some of the standards set by some of the popular food blogs, that they serve a slightly different purpose than community cookbooks. But Lisa, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really striking about the online food blogs and things like that is that it's about the individual or their family, and they often throw quite a few of those sorts of details in it. Whereas with the community book, it really is more about the community as a whole rather than the individual. So they're fulfilling two somewhat different functions. And both of them, of course, have overlaps with the ways in which people have traditionally exchanged recipes, whether or not they're cutting and pasting recipes from newspapers, or they're exchanging them with friends or family, and they end up in your handwritten recipe book, or, the Filofax of recipe cards that people have collected. And both of them overlap with that, but go off in slightly different ways.
One of the things that food historians are interested in, and that Lisa and I have often talked about, is how handwritten recipes, sometimes passed down through generations, become the basis for kind of understanding communities and networks that existed amongst women. I think, studying the history of food and exchanging of recipes is one of the interesting ways to get into the, to the history of women and their lives in the domestic environment, which is sometimes hard for historians to gain access to. And so the kind of like note-taking and recipe books and handing down of recipes, naming things after the aunt who, Auntie Carol's carrot cake is a a recipe you might pass down to the next generation. And those things are so cozy and so nice, and also give us some insights into other people's lives. And I think food bloggers do a bit of that. But it's interesting because it's like, when you go online, you're peeking into the life of a stranger, and there's like a coziness to the tone a lot of the time. But it always makes me wonder, like, is the person really that lovely and sharing, or, is this just an online persona?
It's interesting, isn't it? We've talked a bit about this at work, actually, but, there used to be a lot of illustrated cookbooks, whereas now everything is photographed. And we were saying, is there a difference actually almost in when you see a photograph, you feel you need to aspire to it? Maybe it's a bit more threatening than having a little sketch, like Elizabeth David books or whatever. It's an interesting question. It makes it more aspirational.
Yeah, I love those Elizabeth David books with the drawings.
Yeah. Okay, so it's now time for our final quiz question for everyone at home. So if you were going to give George III an edible gift, what would be most appropriate? Would he like a cake, a grouse, a sheep, or sugar? I think I know what I would like.
I just want to say, no one bring me a sheep for Christmas.
Okay. Has everyone had a chance to think about it? The winner is a grouse. All grouse eaten by George III were apparently gifts. 14 times he was given a grouse. Hopefully had already been, defeathered and looked after. So that was our final quiz question. We are going to turn to audience questions quite soon. But Rachel and Lisa, before that, obviously, a big part of modern life now for many people is travel, and food is a huge part of that, when you're booking your holiday. So I want to ask you if you think that the current pandemic presents new questions about our relationship with food from other parts of the world.
In terms of other parts of the world, I think it's a bit too soon to tell how exactly things are going to play out. But certainly food has been a very central theme throughout the pandemic, whether it's, there's been a lot of comfort eating, right? And, who doesn't know somebody who hasn't had a sourdough starter for the first time and managed to perfect sourdough loaf baking during lockdowns? And the foods differ. I hear banana bread was popular for a while. I don't know what else is on the horizon during the current lockdown. So comfort eating is important, but I think this is also something that is very class-based, right? You need to be middle class as a minimum to have the free time and the energy and the ingredients on hand to do it. One of the big things that has really come out of the pandemic is the problems with food insecurity. And certainly Marcus Rashford's school lunches campaign has highlighted, how many children are going hungry in Britain, especially during lockdown and with rising unemployment. And of course, the food banks were at an all-time high. So, food insecurity has become much worse and will continue to get worse with unemployment. But I think Rachel probably has a more positive line on this.
Well, I was actually also going to say, in terms of food insecurity, Lisa, that, it's such it's been interesting the last few weeks because we've been sort of, talking about the history of the food eaten by a royal family, but we've also been really interested in sort of Marcus Rashford's campaign and how powerful that's been. So we're trying to kind of do two things at once, which is to be conscious of, our privileged position from which we speak. But I think what was interesting at the start of the lockdown was that food insecurity seemed to affect everyone, in that it wasn't just rich or just poor or just, any kind of people. It seemed like everyone wanted to rush to the shops and sort of fill their cupboards with everything they could get their hands on. And so we had a bit of an experience of the pandemic changing a little bit how we shop. And I think for some people that might stay with them, we just don't know yet. But yeah, it's true that I did also think that, in a way, thinking about food and travel, it's what we miss, right? Those of us who are lucky enough to get to travel, we do often, I think about trips in relation to, what we eat on our summer holiday. When you went to Spain, did you have a great paella? for me, going home to Montreal in the summer, I missed eating Montreal bagels this summer. And I don't know about anyone else, but me and my husband have become really addicted to this show called Someone Feed Phil, because he travels around eating great food in all sorts of amazing cities around the world. And I think that it's so much what we're longing for at the moment, that we spend a lot of time planning imaginary trips at the moment. And I don't know if other people are doing that and just dreaming about, what restaurants they'll eat at on their trips and stuff. But yeah, I think that in the sense of how we're kind of coping with the current limitations, maybe fantasizing about exotic foods we'll eat later is helping people get through.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we're all just cooking more than anyone, before as well, aren't we? Like when you're making yourself breakfast, lunch, and dinner 3 times a day, it's even if you like cooking, it gets a lot, right?
It's been a bit of a stretch, hasn't it?
So thank you so much to Rachel and Lisa for this really interesting discussion. We're now opening to audience questions, so I'm going to choose a selection for everyone to answer. So we have a question here from Millie Shepter, who is asking, how expensive would spices have been for the average UK worker?
They would have not been very cheap. I can't tell you the exact price off the top of my head, but they would have been out of reach for most people. That said, sugar was increasingly cheap, as were things like tea, and they would have been staples in most 18th century people's houses, even lower down the social ladder by the later part of the 18th century. So it is an increasing cost, or an increasing standard of living, but luxury spices weren't for everybody.
Veronica Saenz has asked, why did people consider fish and chips as a food for the poor? Which is a good question. Would you like to answer that, Rachel?
I think one of the reasons is really that it does have a very high calorie count. It's very filling. It's very efficient. Potatoes. I mean, I think Lisa talked a little bit earlier about why potatoes, which are a New World food, were adopted so quickly into the British diet, which is because they're really efficient. They grow well. They last fairly long time, and they're filling. So I think that the chips part of fish and chips gives you that, and then the fish is protein, and the batter is it's high calorie. So I think that it's always the case that if you have a limited budget, you have to use food that's going to keep you full for a reasonably long time. And so I think it's probably that straightforward, isn't it? Plus a bit yummy if you like that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there's something in that, isn't it? You always get people saying, it's easy to eat well on not much money, but sometimes, you want something nice. We have another question here from Johanna, who says, you're both Canadian. Are there any Canadian dishes that are or should be in the new British cookbook?
Didn't we talk about this a bit earlier in the week, Lisa? And I felt like, I don't know really what Canadian food is. Lisa and I are from 2 different parts of the country, first of all. So we probably have different food traditions. Where I come from, the influence is much more French. But also because I'm from a Jewish family, I think a lot of the foods I associate with home are probably from that tradition. And one of the things I did do during the lockdown was I have it's not a community cookbook, it's a family cookbook. One of my aunties has made a cookbook where she's, self-published with family photos and recipes for all the things that she cooks at family holidays and get-togethers. And I did cook some of her recipes as part of my homesickness during the summer. So I think for me it would be more things like that, like personal family traditions rather than some sort of Canadian recipes. But Lisa, maybe you have a different feeling about that.
No, I would agree. I think what's interesting about Canada is how localized everything is. So I'm from the prairies, and there's a lot of Polish and Ukrainian immigration there. So there's a lot of Polish and Ukrainian food. And so one of the sort of quintessential dishes there is pierogies. And so, but that, I wouldn't make the pierogies, but you can buy them quite readily. So, what is Canadian food is a perennial question.
Much like what is British food.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's that mingling and coming together of lots of different cultures that makes it very difficult to tease out, what is it?
Someone has also asked, what is a rutabaga, which I think is a Swede. Is that what we call a Swede?
Yes.
There you go. Question answered.
Divided by a common language.
I know. Someone has said, what about the ideas about health or medicinal properties of imported ingredients? Was this taken on by the British population? It's quite interesting.
Yeah. So that list of spices, all of them could have been used medicinally or for culinary purposes. So it often, especially earlier on, you often see a lot of overlap between the spice, the spice sellers, the grocers, and the apothecaries, and it's because these things do overlap so much. And we have also been looking for traces of medicinal food at the king's table, because of course he was being famously treated for mental illness when he was resident at Kew. And there, we can see certain ideas there. For example, those who are servants of the households are fed roast meat and only roast meat, because it's thought that their coarse working class bodies are, this is the meat they need. Whereas the more delicate meats and the richer meats, like chicken, which we wouldn't associate with wealth, but chicken was quite a posh bird at the time, and grouse that we've already talked about, all of this fowl, this was seen as only suitable for a wealthy person's body. Because it was their bodies were more delicate. So yeah, definitely food and medicine overlap in all sorts of interesting ways in this period.
That's really interesting. Someone has said that there was a lot of mention of hybrid foods and an idea that this was part of colonial history. Could you outline the actual processes whereby a dish like chicken tikka masala would become part of the British food repertoire? So I suppose they're thinking things like, what are the processes there of, like, is it something going in a cookbook, or is it something that spreads by word of mouth?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sorry, it's a great question. I'm just not sure I'm going to do it justice. I will certainly try, because I think it's complicated how these things happen. I know that one of the things that happened was that as the British colonized India, people would spend some time there, British people, and then when they would come back to Britain, they would miss the flavors. So on the one hand, they might have very bad things to say about the climate or about the people they met, but nonetheless, in some way, they wanted to appropriate something from India, which was the taste of curry. And so a lot of the availability then of curry powder in shops in London, for example, was to cater originally to that market. But I guess that as more people got to know it, they also liked it. People like good food. So I think it's probably a bit of word of mouth, a bit of just what's available, certainly an element of fashion, because, by the late 19th century, you can eat curry in some restaurants. So people are obviously seeing it as a marketable flavor. So yeah, I think in terms of, sorry, I think the question asked by the audience member was also specifically about the chicken tikka masala example, which we've used, which I gather, my understanding is that that's more of like a 20th century adaptation of kind of using a rich sauce, which is kind of gravy-like. I guess, in terms of hybrid foods, a lot of what British food is, if there is a thing called British food, it's probably the Sunday roast with the meat and the gravy. And what the chicken tikka masala is it's chicken tikka, which is kind of an Indian way of cooking chicken, with the masala sauce, which sort of emulates the British liking for gravy. So I guess it's a marketing opportunity. I think a lot of these things probably are in the end also part of a history of commerce. You know, when people think something's going to sell, they try and sell it.
That's great. Talking of, this fits in quite nicely, but someone has asked, to what extent has British cuisine always been another way of saying English cuisine? Has England always tended to dominate British at the expense of the other nations?
It's complicated. It's very complicated.
Good historian answer.
Yeah, so, I mean, potatoes, for example, we also tend to associate a lot with Irish food for all of those reasons we outlined about them being cheap and easy to grow. So, you know, that speaks to a larger sort of story as well. But yes, I think quite often you do associate, you know, this English and British, they do often get blurred together. But there is a tendency in late 18th century published cookbooks to also start bringing in the local specialties. So, for example, you will find, you know, recipes for Scottish sausages or Scottish haggis alongside Welsh rarebit, alongside, you know, a Yorkshire style pudding, not the Yorkshire pudding, but, you know, other types of puddings. So they do have an idea about regionality, and they are starting to think about, you know, what's everybody in this place eating. But it's not deliberately inclusive, I don't think. It's just that, you know, they think it's a good food, so they're going to put it in the book. Rachel, what do you think?
No, well, I think, yeah, British food can be a stand-in for English food, but also maybe for sort of Southern English food. I think it's even more localized than that. And one of the things, so I have a student who's working on a thesis about food and Northern identity in England. So in Yorkshire, which is where I'm talking to you from, in Leeds, but also sort of the North as that imaginary part of England more broadly. And it's been a really interesting thing to talk about. What are the foods associated with the North? But also the fact that in the period of the late 19th century that my student is studying, the cookbooks are mostly published in London. So you can't get a sense of what the recipes would be, but then there are certain things which are associated with very particular regions. So I don't know if anyone in the audience is from Liverpool, but you'll be thinking, well, what about scouse, which is, you know, the kind of the stew, which also gives its nickname to people from Liverpool. So I think that, you know, again, maybe it also comes back a little bit to the question of power, which I think we talked about earlier in the discussion, which is that in Britain, the power resided very much in and around London. And so the kind of what gets published in terms of recipes and stuff, that's where it's coming from.
It's interesting. In some ways, some people might argue that's not too different today. I think we still have a slightly London-centric view, or a lot of people do, of British food. It's interesting. Another question for you. Do you have a favourite historical recipe that we should all try?
I'm
not involving a whole sheep.
Yeah, you know, I'm not doing that on recreations.
No, but we have been looking at the King's eggs and spinach and thinking it's a relatively easy and tasty sounding one to try, and we keep meaning to try it. So yeah, try some eggs and spinach sometime. That would be good. I don't know if anybody does try eggs and spinach, then let us know. We'd be very curious to know what you think about it.
In the summer, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, in the summer, as part of the British Academy's summer showcase, I actually cooked some 18th century pies. So I cooked a Cheshire pork pie and a raised beefsteak pie. And it was a really fun experience to kind of understand sort of physically what it feels like to cook the things that I normally just read about, and to find out the tastes. But the upshot for me and my family was that we didn't love the flavors. Like, we loved the experience of being able to talk about what the food I'd been researching tasted like. But the Cheshire pork pie had a lot of sugar in it. It was very, very sweet. And I think in the 21st century, we don't like our pork quite that sugary. And the raised beefsteak pie, it ended up being both kind of rich, but also bland. And the upshot, I think the final word on that experiment went to my teenage son, who said the thing is nowadays what people really like is fajitas. Um, so I think that historical cooking, it's a fun adventure, but it doesn't necessarily satisfy our modern tastes.
Well, you won't be recommending that pie then for the next question, because Claire Sutherland has said, any suggestions for an alternative but meat-based Christmas dinner? I'm bored of turkey, but the oven's not big enough for suckling pig.
Lisa, what are you cooking for Christmas this year?
Turkey. We are making turkey. I'm trying to think of an alternative from the King's table. I don't know, maybe try grouse. But you didn't want a meat-based one, did you?
I can tell you that
head.
Oh, boar's head.
I'm sorry, I read something about Christmas dinner and boar's head. Might have made that up.
I mean, one of the things is if you wanted to emulate George III, you'd have to come up with about 21 dishes to put on the table in 2 large services. So it would be quite a task. But I don't know. This year, for the person who asked the question about the alternative, we're going to try a goose this year. We're using a Nigella Lawson recipe. It's a first for us. So, yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Oh yeah, and actually on that, mince pies, those formed quite a big treat around Christmas time at the royal household as well. And in fact, they kept on eating them all the way through the end of February. So enjoy for as long as you can.
I usually have some still knocking around at the end of February, to be honest.
I may have just bought some tonight, so.
Julia B has an interesting question. She says, we're portrayed now as a nation of junk, processed or takeaway food addicts, yet flour and so many traditional foodstuffs flew off the shelves in the first lockdown, which seems to be in conflict with the perception of us not cooking anymore. What's your view on this?
I think often we're time poor, aren't we? I think that people have to get food that's ready made because they don't have the luxury of time to do their own cooking. I think what was nice in the lockdown, and it is hard still, I think, to think about anything being nice about a pandemic, but actually I think the people who were buying all those ingredients off the shelves were probably finding it nice to have the time to do some proper cooking. I also think that it's such a negative stereotype to say, oh, we're a nation of junk food eaters or takeaway eaters. I can't see really what's wrong with doing both. Why can't you on a Sunday cook a beautiful meal and bake a cake from scratch, but on a Wednesday when you're getting home late from work and exhausted, just pick up a curry on the way home? Why does it have to be always one or the other? And I think that often the people who sort of peddle those stereotypes are doing it just to kind of put people down. There's often a very classist element to that. It's often from a kind of affluent perspective, looking down their noses at people who don't have the opportunity or the financial ability to cook great meals from scratch. In fact, it's not popular to say this, but fresh produce is expensive. It is more expensive to chop your own vegetables and do everything from scratch every day. And so if you're managing to do it a couple of times a week and the rest of the time you're getting easy, ready foods, I don't see anything wrong with that.
Alice Nicholas, on a similar note. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, George III never had to chop his own vegetables. It was easy for him to eat only home cooked meals because he had a staff in the kitchen.
So Alice Nicholas, on a kind of similar note, actually says, have you ever surveyed the students at your universities to see the types of food they cook and eat? Or even anecdotally, do you have an idea?
Yeah, so I teach one module where the students often make recipes, and we talk a lot about food in the class. And there's a real mix. You'll have some of them who will do just baked beans on toast, and that's what they do. Others do full-on meals. Others do a lot of takeaway. So it just depends. on the student and their sensibility. And this really comes out when they start to make recipes that are historical as well, is that some students are really confident in tackling some of them, whereas the others take a backseat role, that maybe they do something else to help research the recipe rather than try the hands-on cooking, because it does require a certain level of knowledge to try tackling those things. But yeah, there's a wide variety of what students eat, and a lot of them eat better than I would have expected, but they really try to make an effort.
Yeah, I think that this younger generation is definitely a bit healthier. Okay, well, I think we're nearly out of time. So thanks again, Rachel and Lisa, for joining us. This has been really interesting, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. Stay involved in the conversation. You can share your favourite recipes using the link in the chat box. And these are all going to be gathered into the new British cookbook collection on the team's blog. So tune in to our next virtual event for the Being Human Festival on the 17th of November, which is all about the art of typewriting. And all the details for the events programme can be found on the British Academy website. Thank you so much again, both of you.
Thanks.
And good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.